grabbed my wrist in front of his entire family at Christmas dinner and told me I needed to learn my place. 20 minutes later, he watched me place a folder of documents on the table that would unravel everything he thought he controlled. 7 years. That's how long it took him to finally show his true face in front of witnesses, and how long I'd quietly been preparing for exactly that moment. I should have seen the patterns earlier. My mother-in-law had warned me in her way. Not with words. She'd never do that. But with the look she gave me at our wedding rehearsal dinner, when my husband interrupted me mid-sentence for the 3rd time that evening, and she just smiled and looked down at her plate. I remember thinking she was shy. I was 29 and I didn't know yet that some women learn to disappear. We met through mutual friends at a fundraiser for sick kids in Toronto. He was charming in that particular way that certain men are charming, attentive, funny, the kind of man who makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. He asked questions and actually seemed to listen to the answers. He remembered details. 2 months later, he was introducing me to his parents over dinner at a steakhouse in Oakville, and his mother was already asking about weddings. I was a senior analyst at a consulting firm downtown. I'd worked hard for that position, 5 years building my reputation, 2 promotions, a client portfolio I was proud of. He worked in commercial real estate. He made good money and he knew it. And somewhere in the first year of our marriage, I noticed that he'd started framing every joint financial decision as his decision. Not in a dramatic way. It was subtle enough that I questioned my own perception for a long time. The joint account was his idea. Practical, he said. Easier for shared expenses. And it was at first. But within 18 months, I noticed that my direct deposits would clear. And then, within 48 hours, a portion would transfer to an account I couldn't access. When I asked, he said it was an investment account he was managing for both of us. He showed me a screenshot once, a number that looked like it was growing. I didn't push further. I told myself I trusted him, but I'm a data person by training. I noticed patterns. By year 3, I had started keeping a spreadsheet on my personal laptop, the one I kept in my office, not the shared home computer. Every suspicious transfer, every time my quarterly bonus cleared and something moved. I didn't know yet what I was building. I told myself I was just being organized. The first time I considered talking to a lawyer was after the incident at his work Christmas party. He'd introduced me to a colleague and I'd mentioned my firm, and he'd laughed and said something like, "She thinks what she does is important," to the colleague, while squeezing my shoulder. The colleague had looked uncomfortable. I'd smiled and excused myself to get a drink, and stood in the bathroom for 3 minutes breathing. When I came out, he was already telling another story, and the moment had apparently passed for everyone except me. I started seeing a therapist in January of that year. Dr. Chen, a clinical psychologist with an office near King Street. She was the one who first used the phrase coercive control in our sessions, and I remember feeling both seen and terrified at the same time. Seen because someone had finally named what I was living with, terrified because naming it made it real. By year 5, I was doing things deliberately. The spreadsheet had grown into a full documentation system, time-stamped, backed up on a cloud account he didn't know existed, cross-referenced against our joint bank statements. I had audio recordings of 3 separate conversations where he'd admitted, in passing and while he thought I was just listening, to moving funds in ways that I suspected weren't above board. He was boasting, really. He'd always had a habit of wanting me to know he was smarter than me. I had also, quietly, opened a separate checking account at a different bank. I used my office address for correspondence. Every month, I redirected a small amount from my personal spending. Amounts too small to notice if you weren't looking, but that added up. I wasn't hiding money that was his. I was recovering money that was mine. I found a small condo to rent in the East End, paid the damage deposit in cash, moved things over slowly, a box here, a bag there, always when he was traveling for work. My grandmother's jewelry was the first thing I moved. Then the files I needed. Then the things I actually cared about, which turned out to be less than I expected. I told no one, not my sister, not my closest friend from university. I'd learned from watching what happened to other women in my situation. The moment you tell someone, the moment it becomes real in other people's minds, is often the moment the person you're leaving finds out. I couldn't risk it. Not yet. The Christmas dinner was at his parents' house in Oakville. His father had built a successful landscaping business over 40 years, and he ran his household the same way he ran his cruise. His word was final, full stop. My mother-in-law had been a dental hygienist before she married him, and she hadn't worked since. She was unfailingly gracious and completely hollow in a way that took me years to understand wasn't coldness. It was survival. His sister was there with her husband, a quiet man who said little and watched a lot. His brother was there with a new girlfriend who didn't know yet to keep her opinions small. I brought a bottle of Niagara ice wine because my husband preferred I contribute something appropriate to family occasions rather than attempt to be helpful in the kitchen, which was his mother's domain and not mine to encroach on. Dinner was fine until it wasn't. His father had started in on the subject he returned to whenever he had enough scotch in him. The problem with the current generation, the softness of modern men, the way women had confused freedom with ingratitude. I'd heard this speech before. I usually let it pass. But his new girlfriend, she was maybe 26, a nurse, and she hadn't learned the rhythms yet. She pushed back. Gently, politely, the way you'd push back if you thought the conversation was a normal one. She said something about how partnership in a marriage meant both people having a voice. My husband's father set down his glass. My husband laughed in that particular way of his, a short, dismissive exhale, and said that was a lovely idea for people who didn't understand how things actually worked. And then he looked at me across the table and said, in front of everyone, that I was a perfect example of a woman who'd needed to be reminded of that more than once. I felt something go very still inside me. His sister's husband looked at his plate. His mother reached for her wine glass. His brother said nothing. The girlfriend looked at me with wide eyes, waiting to see what I would do, what someone who knew the landscape would do. My husband reached over and closed his hand around my wrist. Not hard enough to be called grabbing, just hard enough to communicate. "You understand what I mean," he said, "not a question." 7 years. I looked at him. I felt completely calm. "Actually," I said, "I think this is a good time." I reached into the bag I'd placed beside my chair at the beginning of dinner, a detail he hadn't noticed, because I was always the one who came early to help set up, and he'd never paid attention to what I brought with me, and I placed a folder on the table between us. "I've been doing some bookkeeping," I said. "Thought you might want to review it with your dad here, since some of it involves him." His father started to say something. I said, "I'd finish your drink first, Douglas." The name landed differently when I used it directly. His children never did. Inside the folder were printed summaries, not the full documentation, just the highlights, 3 years of irregular transfers from our joint account to a numbered company. Consulting fees paid to his father's landscaping business for services to a property my husband owned that had never, to my knowledge, required landscaping. A pattern that any CRA auditor would find interesting, I noted, though of course I hadn't involved anyone yet. That was still my choice to make. My husband's face went through several things in rapid succession. Disbelief first, the particular disbelief of someone who has never genuinely considered that you might be paying attention, then calculation, then something that looked almost like fear. "You don't understand what you're looking at," he said. "I'm a senior analyst," I said. "Financial modelling is literally my job." His mother made a small sound. Not a word, just a sound. I stood up. I thanked her for dinner, genuinely. She was a wonderful cook, and none of what was happening was her fault. I told his father that I hoped they'd consult a lawyer before doing anything reactive, because anything he did in the next 30 days would be observable. I looked at my husband and I said calmly that I'd already moved out, that my own lawyer would be in touch on Monday, and at the locks on the condo we'd owned together. in my name as primary, a detail he'd agreed to for mortgage rate reasons 3 years ago, would be changed by Tuesday evening. He stood up. "You can't." "I'd sit back down," I said. I wasn't threatening. I was stating a fact, and something in my voice communicated that I had thought through every version of how this conversation could go. My lawyer's name is on the second page of that folder. Everything else is already in her hands. I picked up my bag. His sister caught my eye across the table. Her expression was something I hadn't expected to see. Not horror, not judgment, something closer to recognition. I drove back into the city in the dark, hands steady on the wheel, the 403 quiet for a December night. I pulled over once, just past the Burlington Skyway, not because I was shaking, but because I needed a moment to let it be real. 7 years of a particular kind of careful living. And now it was done. My phone started filling up within the hour. His messages first. 3 texts that moved from confusion to accusation to something that wanted to sound like a threat, but couldn't quite land because he knew I had the folder. Then his father, a voicemail I saved without listening to until the next morning. Then his brother, a text that just said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." I believed him. I believed most people in that room hadn't known the full picture. They'd known something was off the way you can sense weather before it arrives, but they hadn't known the specifics. His sister called at 11 that night. I answered. "I've been watching him become our father for years," she said. I didn't know how to say anything. "You didn't have to," I said. "You just had to not be involved." She hadn't been. That mattered. My lawyer had been briefed since September. She was thorough, and she'd seen worse. She told me that the first time we met, not as comfort, but as context. On Monday morning, she sent the first set of correspondence. By Wednesday, his firm had received a letter. By the following week, his father had hired his own counsel, which had the effect of separating their legal interests in a way that would not benefit either of them. He showed up at my new building 3 days after the dinner. I'd expected this. He had my address through the condo ownership transfer documents, which were a matter of public record and which I'd known he'd find. I'd already spoken to the building superintendent. I buzzed him into the lobby and spoke to him on the intercom. "You should talk to your lawyer before you say anything to me," I said. "This conversation is being recorded." "You have no right to do any of this," he said. His voice had a quality I recognized, the voice he used when he felt the ground shifting. "I have every right," I said. I documented my contributions to every joint account. I retained independent legal advice. I followed every step correctly. If you'd like to dispute any of that, your lawyer can contact mine. He left. I watched him go on the lobby camera from my phone. His father's business became the subject of a CRA inquiry the following spring, not because of anything I filed directly, but because the letter my lawyer sent to his firm had prompted their own internal review, and the information had moved through channels the way information does when it involves a financial institution's compliance obligations. I hadn't set out to destroy anything. I'd simply stopped protecting the secrets that weren't mine to keep. What I hadn't anticipated was his mother. She called me 2 months after the dinner. I almost didn't answer. I didn't recognize the number at first, and then I did, and I sat with the ringing for a moment before picking up. She said she'd been thinking for a long time, and that watching me that night at the table had been like seeing a door she'd always pretended wasn't there. We had coffee downtown. She looked different outside her own kitchen, smaller in some ways, more solid in others. She'd made an appointment with her own lawyer the week before, she said, not because of me specifically, but because she'd realized that what she was protecting had never actually protected her. "I spent 40 years making sure the table was set correctly," she said. "I don't think I know what I actually like to eat." She filed for separation in February. Douglas fought it with everything he had, which turned out to be less than either of them had believed, because a significant portion of what they owned together was entangled in the business interests that were now under scrutiny. I won't claim credit for that. She made her choice on her own timeline, for her own reasons. I was just the person who'd shown up at Christmas dinner with a folder. My sister took me to a long weekend in Prince Edward County in January. Wine country, quiet, the kind of trip you don't realize you needed until you're already there. I told her everything. She cried a little, and then she got angry in the way that older sisters do. And then she poured more wine and asked me what I actually wanted to do with my life, in a way that felt like a real question. I'd been offered a partnership track position at a competing firm. I took it. The work was harder and the hours were longer, but nobody laughed at my spreadsheets or suggested I was taking things too seriously. I found an apartment I genuinely liked. High ceilings, a balcony that looked out at the tree canopy along a residential street, a coffee shop downstairs that knew my order by February. The divorce took 11 months, which my lawyer said was relatively clean given the complexity of the financial disputes. He pushed back on everything he thought he could push back on, and each time he did, my documentation answered for me. By the end, he'd stopped responding to certain points entirely, which his lawyer apparently found frustrating. I found it satisfying in a quiet way. I'm not going to say the hard parts weren't hard. There were mornings in January where the apartment felt very empty, and the city outside was grey, and I questioned every decision I'd ever made, including decisions that had turned out correctly. Grief is not logical. You can grieve something that was making you smaller. You can miss the routine of a life that was damaging you, and feel no contradiction in also knowing you were right to leave it. Dr. Chen helped me understand that. We kept meeting every 2 weeks for the first year. She said once that what I'd done, the years of careful documentation, the methodical planning, had given me something most people in my situation don't have, which was agency at the moment of departure. But it had also meant spending 3 years emotionally at a distance from my own life, and that distance had its own cost. You were in survival mode so long you'll need time to remember what it feels like to just live, she said. She was right. His sister and I have coffee occasionally. She's not trying to maintain a connection to her family through me or mediate anything. She's just a person who saw something true happen and wanted to stay in proximity to it. Her relationship with her brother is its own complicated territory that I stay entirely out of. Her mother is taking a watercolour class at a community centre in Burlington and apparently is quite good. 8 months after the divorce was finalised, I ran into him at a conference, the kind of industry overlap that's inevitable in a city like Toronto. He looked fine externally, a bit diminished in a way that was hard to name precisely. He approached me and said something about how we'd both moved on, and hoped there were no hard feelings. I told him I didn't have hard feelings. I told him that what happened between us had clarified things for me in ways that were ultimately useful, and I meant it. I watched his face process that. The fact that I wasn't angry, wasn't wounded, wasn't performing indifference. I was just a person he used to know, and that was all. He walked away and I went back to my table and finished my lunch and thought about a case I was working on. And it wasn't until I was on the subway home that I realized I hadn't thought about him once for the rest of the afternoon. There's a particular kind of freedom in becoming irrelevant to someone's internal landscape. I used to organize my whole life around the weather of his moods. Now he doesn't factor into my calculations at all. I think about the girlfriend from that Christmas dinner sometimes. She sent me a message through LinkedIn a few weeks after, a short note that just said she'd been paying attention and thank you. I wrote back, "We've never met in person, but I like knowing she was in that room, watching, and understood something about what she was seeing. Sometimes that's all it takes, one person who sees clearly and acts from that clarity and trusts that some things need to be named before they can change." The wrist he grabbed at that table has a small bracelet on it now, one I bought for myself in a jewellery shop on Queen Street West the week the divorce was finalised. It's not symbolic exactly, I just liked it. I bought it because I liked it, and I wore it because I wanted to, and that the complete ordinariness of that small freedom, turned out to be exactly what coming home felt like. I didn't leave because I was brave. I want to be honest about that. I left because I had spent 3 years making sure that when I did, there was nothing left for him to use against me. That's a different thing. And it took me a long time in Dr. Maya Chen's office to understand that careful isn't the same as cowardly, and that protecting yourself quietly, methodically, without drama, is its own kind of courage. What I know now is that the outcomes in my life, the ones that actually held, came from 3 things working together. The first was integrity, not the word people put on LinkedIn, but the real version. Staying honest with myself about what was happening even when it was easier not to. Every time I made a note in that spreadsheet, every time I photographed a document or saved a recording, I was refusing to lie to myself about what my marriage actually was. That refusal cost something. It meant I couldn't pretend. But it also meant that when the moment came at that Christmas table in Oakville, I wasn't performing. I was simply showing what had always been true. The second thing was clear. Thinking. I'm a data person. And that turned out to matter in ways I hadn't expected. My husband believed that controlling the information controlled me. He thought that because he managed the accounts I couldn't see the pattern. He forgot, or maybe never understood, that I do financial modelling for a living. The skills I'd built professionally, the habit of looking for inconsistencies, of cross-referencing and documenting and backing things up, those didn't stop when I came home. I just stopped showing him I was using them. Clear thinking isn't cold. It's what lets you act from a place of knowledge instead of panic. The third thing was the willingness to keep going when there was no visible reward for it yet. 3 years is a long time to document something quietly, to move things slowly, to maintain a surface while building something underneath it. There were months when I questioned whether I was being paranoid, months when it would have been so much easier to just stop. The only thing that kept me going was the knowledge that I owed myself the truth, and that the truth required preparation before it could be spoken safely. Douglas got what came from his own choices. I don't say that with any satisfaction, it's just what happened. When you spend decades managing people through fear and using institutions to protect behaviour that can't survive scrutiny, the consequences aren't punishment from somewhere outside. They're just the natural end of a particular way of living. His son learned from him, and I believe, though I can't know for certain, that Eleanor leaving Douglas was partly her own version of the same reckoning, a woman finally deciding that the cost of her own silence had become too high. What I hope, if someone is reading this who recognizes something in it, is that the preparation is the point, not the confrontation. The confrontation is one afternoon. The preparation is who you become while you're doing it. I became someone who trusted her own observations, someone who knew her own financial history, someone who had already, quietly, built the next chapter before she needed to walk into it. The bracelet on my wrist cost $40 at a shop on Queen Street. I bought it because I wanted it. That's still the detail that gets me.